I think I didn't do anything wrong, just showed support where it was deserved. My husband had been cold for months, and my lover only said what everyone else was too scared to say. I laughed, I clapped, I even thought I'd won, until the next day when the letter arrived and silence became his revenge. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I think I didn't do anything wrong, just supported the truth when it finally came out. If people were uncomfortable, that's on them, not me. Everyone always said Adrian was perfect, successful, polite, composed. But no one saw how small he made me feel. Ethan did. That's what started everything. Attention shouldn't be a crime. It began at work, in a marketing firm where creativity mattered more than politeness. Ethan Cole joined as our new consultant, confident, loud, and everything Adrian wasn't. I liked how he filled the air with noise. My husband, Adrian Delane, was an architect. He lived in blueprints, not conversations. He could go a whole dinner without saying a word beyond pass the salt. I used to think it meant he was deep. Later, I realized it just meant he didn't care to talk to me. Ethan noticed me during a client meeting. He joked about how I commanded the room. Afterward, he stopped by my desk to say I made even boring projects sound exciting. I laughed and said, "That's my job." He said, "No, that's your charm." It was just a line, but it landed right in the space where Adrian's silence used to be. At home, things were mechanical. Adrian came in late, checked his phone, and went straight to his study. I'd ask about his day. He'd say it was fine. I'd tell him about mine. He'd nod without listening. I started staying at work longer because at least there's someone noticed when I spoke. My younger sister Olivia said I was overreacting. She said Adrian was steady, dependable, loyal. I told her steady and loyal felt a lot like invisible. She told me to stop chasing validation. I said, "You talk like him." That ended the conversation. Ethan became my daily distraction. He started texting me in the evenings, funny memes, little jokes about the office. I told myself it was harmless. One night, after a long meeting, he said, "You know, I don't get how a woman like you goes home to a man who doesn't worship her." I said, "He's just quiet." He said, "No, he's empty." I laughed, but my hands were shaking when I typed back. I tried telling Adrian once that I felt unseen. He said, "You're not unseen. I'm just tired." I said, "You're always tired." He said, "You're always dramatic." I said, "And you're always cold." He stood there for a moment and said, "Maybe silence is safer than saying what I really think." Then he walked out. I spent the night replaying those words, wondering what he thought he was protecting me from. At work, Ethan started visiting my office more often. He'd bring coffee, lean against my desk, and ask about my marriage like he was doing research. He said, "He's lucky you're patient." I said, "He doesn't see it that way." He said, "Then maybe you're wasting patience on the wrong person." I didn't answer, but I smiled. He took that as permission. We started having lunch together, just the two of us. I told him about Adrian's silences, the dinners eaten in separate rooms, how I felt like furniture in my own home. Ethan said, "You deserve to be the loudest thing in someone's life." It was such a stupid line, but I believed it. At home, Adrian noticed I was dressing differently, wearing perfume again. He didn't comment, not even once. I tried to provoke him by saying, "People at work say I seem happier lately." He said, "That's good." I said, "You don't even ask why." He said, "If it's good, I don't need to." His indifference felt like a challenge I had to win. The next Friday, Ethan invited me to a small after-work gathering at a rooftop bar. He said, "Bring your husband if you want. It'll make things interesting." I laughed, assuming he was joking. That night, when I told Adrian about it, he said, "I don't like those work parties." I said, You never like anything social. He said, because social usually means you pretending to be someone else. I said, maybe I like that version of me better. He said, that's the problem. At the bar, Ethan introduced me to everyone as the genius behind the campaigns. I glowed. People laughed at my jokes, asked my opinions. I hadn't felt that kind of warmth in years. Adrian texted once. When will you be home? I replied, later. I didn't specify how much later. When I finally did get home, Adrian was still awake. He asked if I'd had fun. I said yes. He said, did you get what you needed? I said, meaning what? He said, meaning whatever it is you keep searching for out there. I told him he was trying to make me feel guilty. He said, I'm just asking if it was worth it. I said, it's not cheating to laugh. He said, it depends on who you're laughing with. Then he went upstairs. I told Ethan about it the next day, pretending to be annoyed but secretly thrilled by the tension. He said, sounds like jealousy. I said, he's too proud to be jealous. He said, then let's give him a reason. I told him not to be ridiculous. He said, I'm just saying, some people only learn when they're embarrassed. The thought stuck with me. Maybe humiliation was the only language Adrian would understand. Maybe if someone else showed him what it felt like to be ignored, he'd finally wake up. That weekend, we had dinner with Adrian's mother, Helen. She asked why he looked so tired. He said, long week. She looked at me and said, you've been out a lot lately. I smiled and said, networking. She said, that's what people call it now. Adrian didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. When we got home, I told him his mother was rude. He said, she just sees more clearly than most. I said, so you agree with her? He said, I didn't say that. I said, you didn't say anything at all. He said, that's usually safer. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking of Ethan's voice. Some people only learn when they're embarrassed. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe silence needed a stage to break it. By Monday morning, I'd made up my mind. There was a team dinner coming up, the one Ethan was organizing. He told me to bring Adrian, so everyone could finally meet the mysterious husband. I said I would. This time, I'd make sure Adrian noticed me, one way or another. The night of the team dinner arrived faster than I expected. I told Adrian 2 days before, casually, like it wasn't important. He was in the middle of sketching something in his notebook when I said, we're invited to a dinner on Friday, Ethan's team thing. You should come. He didn't look up at first. Then he said, should? I said, it would be nice. He said, you mean it would look nice? I laughed and told him he was paranoid. He didn't argue, just nodded once and said, then I'll be there. I didn't expect him to actually show. He hated public events, especially ones full of loud people like Ethan. On Friday, I dressed carefully. Black dress, red lipstick, something bold. When I came downstairs, Adrian was already waiting by the door, wearing a dark suit. He looked better than I remembered, and for a brief moment, I regretted everything. Then I thought about how he'd sat silent through all my efforts for years, and the regret passed. Ethan picked the restaurant, a sleek place downtown with glass walls and too many mirrors. When we walked in, he waved across the room, loud as always. Iris, he called, finally, the star of the campaign. Everyone turned to look. Adrian followed quietly behind me. Ethan extended a hand to him and said, you must be the lucky man. Adrian shook his hand and said, lucky is one word for it. His tone was unreadable, polite to the point of cruelty. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The table was long and full of people I barely knew. Ethan dominated the conversation, telling jokes, teasing co-workers, praising me for saving the campaign from disaster. I laughed, partly because it was true, mostly because I liked the attention. Adrian sat beside me, silent as usual, eating slowly, listening to everything. I pretended not to notice his quiet. At one point, Ethan leaned over and said loudly, "I don't know how you keep up with her, man. Iris runs circles around all of us." Everyone laughed. Adrian smiled faintly and said, "She's always been good at running." There was an edge to it, but no one caught it except me. The more the wine flowed, the bolder Ethan became. He started telling stories about work, how I handled clients like a queen, how I made every man in the office nervous. Someone said I must have a secret weapon. Ethan said, confidence, and maybe those eyes. The table roared with laughter. I smiled even though my face felt hot. Adrian didn't laugh. He placed his fork down neatly and sipped his water. Olivia was there too, invited by one of the designers. She sat a few seats away, watching me with that mixture of pity and warning she'd worn for months. I ignored her. This was my night. I was tired of apologizing for being interesting. Then Ethan crossed a line. He said, "You know, Adrian, we were just talking earlier about how hard it must be to be married to someone like Iris. All that energy, all that attention, most men couldn't handle it." I laughed because that's what people expected me to do. But then he added, "Don't worry though, she's got enough fans to make up for it." The table went quiet, the kind of silence that falls right before something shatters. I should have stopped it there. I should have said it was a joke gone too far. But instead, I clapped, once, loudly, like it was a punchline worth celebrating. "Finally, someone said it," I joked. A few nervous chuckles followed. Adrian didn't react. He didn't even look at me. He just folded his napkin, placed it on the table, stood up and said, "Excuse me." His voice was calm, measured, like he was excusing himself from an ordinary meeting. Then he walked out. Ethan blinked, maybe realizing too late that he'd gone too far. He muttered something about just joking, but no one laughed. I sat there, pretending everything was fine, even though I could feel Olivia's eyes burning through me. She leaned across the table and whispered, "What did you just do?" I said, "He's overreacting." She said, "No, you're underreacting." I waited another 10 minutes, sipping my drink, smiling at nothing. When I finally went outside, Adrian's car was gone. I called him. No answer. I texted, "You're being ridiculous." He didn't reply. At home, the house felt colder than usual. His jacket was gone from the hook. His shoes weren't by the door. I went upstairs and found his closet half empty. The toothbrush, the razor, gone. My chest tightened, but I told myself it was temporary. He'd come back after cooling off. He always did. The next morning, Olivia showed up uninvited. She said, "He stayed at Mum's last night." I said, "So he's safe?" She said, "That's not the point." I said, "Then what is?" She said, "You humiliated him, Iris, in front of everyone, and you clapped." I rolled my eyes. It was a joke. She said, "No, it was a choice." For days, Adrian didn't call, not once. Ethan texted to say he didn't mean to make things messy. I told him not to worry, that Adrian just needed to calm down. He replied, "Sure, but maybe give him space." He looked like a man who's already made up his mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence in the house didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt final. I tried calling Adrian again, straight to voicemail. I left a message. "You're acting like a child. I didn't do anything wrong." The next morning, I found an envelope under the door, my name written in his handwriting. Inside was a note. "You finally got your applause. Now you can keep it. The rest is mine." No signature, no goodbye, just that one cruel, perfect line. I read it 3 times, waiting for the anger to come. Instead, I laughed. I told myself it was dramatic, that he'd be back once the show was over. But somewhere underneath the laughter, something cold was growing. It wasn't guilt, it was fear. Fear that maybe, for once, he wasn't bluffing. The first week without Adrian felt unreal. The house looked the same, but everything in it had lost meaning. His shoes were gone, his books missing from the shelf, but his scent still lingered faintly in the hallway. I told myself he'd cool off, that he was just proving a point, but deep down I knew something had shifted. His silence wasn't avoidance anymore, it was strategy. Olivia stopped by one morning. She said, "You look awful." I told her to mind her own business. She asked if Adrian had called. I said, "He's acting like a child." She said, "He's acting like a man who's finally done." That word, done, sat between us like a verdict. At work, Ethan avoided me. He was suddenly too busy for lunch, too polite in meetings. When I confronted him, he said, "You told me to back off." I said, "I told you to let things calm down." He said, "Then let them." His tone had changed, measured, cautious, as if I'd become a liability. It made my stomach twist. 3 days later, a courier arrived at the office with a thick envelope. The receptionist looked uncomfortable as she handed it to me. Inside were legal documents, notice of separation proceedings. My name printed in black ink, cold and final. Attached was a typed letter from Adrian's lawyer, Daniel Wu. Our client requests no further personal contact pending mediation. I reread the line several times. Our client. He wasn't my husband anymore. He was a client. I went straight to Olivia's apartment, waving the papers. I said, "Can you believe this? He's suing me." She said, "It's not a lawsuit, it's protection." I said, "From what?" She said, "From you." That night, I called Adrian anyway, straight to voicemail. I left a message saying we could fix things, that it didn't have to go this far. No response. I tried again the next day. Nothing. By the third call, his number went straight to "no longer in service." I felt the air leave my chest. I drove to his mother's house. Helen opened the door before I even knocked twice. She looked me up and down like I was something dragged in by the rain. I said, "I just need to talk to him." She said, "He doesn't live here anymore." I said, "Where is he?" She said, "Somewhere peaceful, somewhere you can't follow." I told her she was cruel. She said, "Cruelty is clapping while your husband is humiliated in front of strangers." I said, "It was a joke." She said, "No, it was pride." Then she closed the door. When I got back home, the mailbox was full of letters, bills, statements, all addressed to me alone. The joint account was frozen. I called the bank, demanding to know why. The representative said, "Per the legal order, your access is suspended until review." I felt my voice shake as I said, "He can't do that." The woman said, "He already did." I threw my phone across the room, then picked it up again, desperate for someone to blame. I called Ethan. This time he answered. I said, "You started this." He said, "No, you did when you clapped." I said, "You said he needed to be put in his place." He said, "I didn't say ruin your marriage." I asked if he even cared. He said, "Honestly, Iris, I'm trying to keep my job." Then he hung up. For the first time in months, I felt completely alone. Days turned into weeks. Adrian didn't come for his things. He'd already taken what mattered. The rest, clothes, photos, books, felt like leftovers. I tried to act unfazed, posting pictures of myself at cafes, captions like "moving on gracefully." People commented supportive emojis, but I could feel the whisper behind them, pity disguised as encouragement. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from Daniel Wu's office, asking if I could attend a preliminary meeting. I said, "I have nothing to say." The assistant replied, "Then the court will speak for you." I went anyway. The office was glassy and cold. Adrian sat across the table, calm as ever. He didn't look at me, just at the folder in front of him. Daniel Wu greeted me politely, then explained the process. Asset division, custody for Liam, communication through counsel. I said, "This is insane." Adrian finally spoke. "You made it public. I'm just making it legal." I tried to argue. I said, "I never cheated." He said, "That's not the point." I said, "Then what is?" He said, "Respect." His tone was flat, almost gentle, but it hit harder than any shouting could. Daniel went over the next steps, his voice low and professional. I barely listened. My eyes were on Adrian's hands, how steady they were, how his ring was gone. He didn't fidget, didn't sigh, didn't even look tired. He looked free. When the meeting ended, he stood and said, "Take care of yourself." I said, "That's it?" He said, "That's all there's left." Then he left the room without a backward glance. I sat there long after he was gone, staring at the empty chair. Daniel asked if I wanted copies of the documents. I said no. What good were papers when everything I wanted had already signed itself away? That night, I came home and found the framed wedding photo on the floor. The glass had cracked cleanly through the middle, separating our faces. I hadn't touched it. Maybe it had fallen on its own. Maybe the house had finally decided to tell the truth. I picked it up and whispered, "You can't just erase me." But deep down, I knew he already had. When I looked at my phone again, there was one new message from an unknown number. Just 2 words, "Check your mail." Outside, the wind was cold. In the mailbox, I found another envelope. Inside was a copy of a new custody agreement, with Adrian's signature already there, but no space left for mine. I read the line at the bottom, "Pending full custody transfer, visitation restricted until further notice." For the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt invisible. I'd spent so long demanding to be seen that I'd forgotten what it felt like to disappear completely. I woke up the next morning convinced it was a mistake, that some lawyer had gotten ahead of himself. But the papers were still there, sitting on the kitchen table like proof of my own arrogance. I tried to eat, couldn't. I tried to work, couldn't. Every sound in the house, every creak, every hum, felt like it belonged to someone else now. I called Olivia again. She didn't pick up. I left a message saying I needed her help, that Adrian was going too far. She finally called back that afternoon, her voice low. "He's not going too far," she said. "He's just done being humiliated." I said, "So he's punishing me?" She said, "He's protecting himself." I said, "You sound like his lawyer." She said, "Maybe because he's finally acting like one." At work, people had started whispering. Someone must have told them about the dinner. Maybe Ethan, maybe one of the designers. When I walked into the break room, conversation stopped. I told myself they were jealous. I told myself they didn't understand. But even the ones who used to laugh at my jokes avoided eye contact. Ethan tried to stay out of it. When I cornered him after a meeting, he said, "I think we need to keep things professional." I said, "You mean pretend nothing happened?" He said, "That's usually the best option." I asked if he was embarrassed. He said, "Not exactly, just careful." That word, careful, made me want to scream. That weekend, I went to Helen's house again, desperate for some kind of conversation. She opened the door and said, "You shouldn't be here." I said, "I need to see Liam." She said, "He's with his father. That's where he feels safe." I said, "You're poisoning him against me." She said, "No, he's just watching how adults treat each other." I felt something break inside me. I told her she'd always hated me, that she'd never thought I was good enough. She said, "You made that clear on your own. You just needed a crowd to clap for it." I said, "You're twisting things." She said, "That's what liars always think." Then she shut the door again. The drive home felt endless. When I got there, the mailbox was full again. Bills, legal notices, and one plain envelope from Daniel Wu's office. Inside was a financial breakdown. Adrian had transferred most of our savings into a trust for Liam, citing stability and security. My access was restricted pending the final ruling. The letter ended with, "Please refrain from public commentary or online statements related to the matter." I threw it across the room. For a long moment, I just stood there staring at the mess, the papers scattered across the floor, like evidence of every choice I'd defended. That night, I called Ethan again, straight to voicemail. I texted, "I need to talk." No response. I sent another, You don't get to vanish after all this. Still nothing. By midnight, I was shaking with anger. I texted one more time. You said you'd stand by me. Then I deleted it. The next day, Olivia showed up at my door. I asked if Adrian sent her. She said, he didn't have to. She looked around the house, the empty spaces where things used to be. You should sell, she said quietly. You can't afford to stay here. I said, I'm not giving him the satisfaction. She said, this isn't about satisfaction, it's about reality. I told her I could fix this. She said, how? By posting more quotes about empowerment, by pretending you didn't laugh when Ethan mocked your husband in front of everyone. I said, it was a joke. She said, you've said that so many times it doesn't even sound like English anymore. I felt my face burn. He made me feel invisible, I said, for years. She said, so you made him a spectacle. Congratulations. She turned to leave, but before she walked out, she said, you should call your lawyer. He's moving fast. When she was gone, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop. My inbox was flooded. Notifications, replies, comments on old posts. Someone had shared the dinner story online. People were calling it the clapping wife. Some defended me, saying I was brave for calling out male fragility. Others said I was cruel. I wanted to believe the first group, but the more I scrolled, the worse it felt. None of them knew the truth, and yet, somehow, they all did. That night, I sat by the window, looking at the dark street outside. Across town, Adrian was probably tucking Liam into bed, maybe reading the same story he used to read when we were still us. The thought made me furious and hollow all at once. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one marked notice of hearing, custody and asset division. Inside was a short note from Adrian, handwritten but cold. Please attend. It's time to stop pretending. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I tore the letter in half and threw it away. But it didn't matter. The date was already carved into my mind. At work, the HR manager called me in. She said, there's concern about the ongoing public discussion of your personal matters. I said, that's none of the company's business. She said, when it involves clients, it is. I asked what she meant. She said, Ethan requested reassignment to avoid conflict of interest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Even Ethan had found a way to rewrite the story so he came out clean. That evening, I sat on the floor surrounded by papers and wine glasses. I tried to tell myself I still had a chance to fix things, that Adrian's calmness was temporary. But the truth kept slipping in through the cracks. His silence wasn't anger anymore. It was closure. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. No new messages, no missed calls, just a notification from the court's online system confirming my case file had been processed. I turned off the light and whispered to the empty room, he's bluffing. But even as I said it, I didn't believe myself. The quiet was too complete, too deliberate. For the first time, it felt like the silence was his final word, and it was louder than anything I'd ever said. The day of the hearing arrived grey and cold. I hadn't slept. My clothes felt too tight, my reflection too sharp. When I walked into the courthouse, I saw Adrian already there, standing with Daniel Wu. He looked calm, even rested, wearing the same suit from our wedding day. I wanted that to hurt him, but it didn't. It hurt me instead. Karen, my lawyer, arrived late, flipping through a folder. She said, "Stay composed. Don't interrupt," I said. "He's making me look like a monster." She said, "That's because you keep feeding him the material." Her tone was flat, not unkind, but stripped of sympathy. We sat across from each other, separated by a long wooden table. Adrian didn't look at me, only at the judge. When the proceedings began, Daniel spoke first. He described a marriage eroded by public ridicule and breach of trust. Every word felt like a blade dipped in calm water. He submitted evidence, witness statements from the dinner, screenshots of messages between Ethan and me, and printed posts from my social media. The judge asked if I disputed the authenticity. Karen whispered, "Don't argue about proof. Argue about motive." So I said, "Yes, I wrote them, but I was hurt." The judge said, "So you humiliated him publicly because you were hurt privately?" I said, "It wasn't like that." But even as I spoke, it sounded exactly like that. Daniel read aloud Ethan's statement, short, professional, cowardly. It said our relationship had been misinterpreted, that any personal exchanges were unrelated to professional duties. I almost laughed. The same man who once whispered about wanting to rescue me from silence had now deleted himself from my story. Karen tried to redirect the argument. She said, "My client admits her conduct was inappropriate, but not malicious. This is an emotional misunderstanding, not abandonment." The judge asked, "Then why has the husband filed for sole custody and full property transfer?" Karen hesitated. "Because," she said, "he's punishing her." Adrian finally spoke. "No, I'm protecting our son." His voice was steady, quiet. "I don't want Liam growing up learning that cruelty is entertainment, or that love is something you prove by tearing someone down." He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His words landed exactly where they were meant to. I wanted to shout, to tell everyone that he was the cold one, the unfeeling one, the man who'd ignored me for years. But every sentence I formed sounded smaller in my head. Because even now, he wasn't fighting. He was dismantling me with stillness. When the recess came, I found myself alone in the hallway. Olivia appeared out of nowhere. She said, "You should go home." I said, "You're on his side." She said, "I'm on the side that's finally quiet." I told her she had no idea what it was like to live with someone who treated silence as punishment. She said, "I do now." Then she walked away. Back in the courtroom, Helen was sitting in the back row, hands clasped, watching me like she'd already seen this ending before. When Daniel called her to testify, she spoke softly, but without hesitation. Adrian never defended himself because he knew she'd only twist it into proof that she was right. That's what she does. She confuses attention for love and applause for truth. The judge nodded slightly, taking notes. I wanted to scream at Helen that she'd always hated me, that she'd been waiting for this. But Karen leaned in and said, "Don't. Every word you say now writes as victory." When it was my turn, I tried to sound composed. I said I'd only wanted recognition, that my laughter at the dinner had been nervous, not cruel. The judge asked if I understood how my actions looked to others. I said, "People misunderstood." She said, "Or they saw clearly." By the time the session ended, I already knew the outcome. The details didn't matter. Bank accounts, custody schedules, visitation terms, they were just formalities. Adrian had already won by refusing to play my game. As we left the courtroom, I caught up to him in the corridor. I said, "You're really going to take everything?" He said, "I'm taking back my piece." I said, "You don't get to rewrite history." He said, "History isn't written by the loudest voice. It's written by whoever's left standing." Then he walked away. Karen told me to go home and wait for the final decision. "It'll come by mail," she said. "You'll want to prepare yourself." I asked, "Prepare for what?" She said, "For silence. That's what comes next." On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the night at the restaurant, the way Ethan laughed, the way I clapped, the way Adrian's eyes had dimmed without anger, without words. I had thought silence meant weakness. Now I understood it was judgment. That evening, I poured another glass of wine and opened my laptop. Every article about the case, every comment, every hashtag, it all blurred into one message. He handled it with grace. She fell apart in public. I closed the screen and sat there in the dim light, realizing that the one thing I'd always wanted, attention, had finally turned into evidence against me. The doorbell rang just before midnight. Another courier. Another envelope. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what was inside. The sound of paper tearing was the sound of finality. The first page read, Preliminary ruling. Custody to the petitioner. Full transfer of primary residence. Asset separation confirmed. I stopped reading there. The rest didn't matter. The only thing left in my name was the echo of my own applause. For the first time, I didn't feel righteous. I felt erased. And I wondered if that was what Adrian had wanted all along, to teach me that silence, once weaponized, doesn't shout back. It simply outlasts you. The final judgment arrived a week later in a thick white envelope. No return address, no warning. I let it sit on the counter for hours. I knew what it said before I even tore it open, but seeing the words in print still felt like a punch. Custody granted to petitioner. Residence awarded to petitioner. Visitation subject to review. Everything I'd once called mine was now legally his. Even my son had been folded into a paragraph of tidy language. Karen called that afternoon, her voice careful. She said, "It's finalized. There's nothing more to contest." I asked if Adrian had said anything. She said he didn't need to. I hung up before she could say more. The house felt foreign now, his mug on the shelf, his handwriting on the old grocery list still stuck to the fridge. I sat at the table with the papers spread out in front of me, pretending to study them like they were a project I could still edit. But no matter how many times I read the lines, the result didn't change. He'd won without shouting, without threats, without a single cruel word. Olivia came by the next day. She brought coffee but didn't sit down. She said, "He came to pick up the last of his things. He didn't want to bother you." I said, "He could have called." She said, "He doesn't call anymore." I asked how Liam was. She said, "Quiet, happier." I said, "That's impossible." She said, "Maybe it's just peace." When she left, I sat staring at the wall for a long time. The silence I used to crave was unbearable now. It wasn't freedom, it was exile. Later that evening, I decided to see for myself. I drove to Adrian's new place on the edge of town. The lights were on, the curtains open. Through the window, I saw Liam sitting at the table doing homework while Adrian washed dishes. The scene was so ordinary it made my throat close. I'd always accused Adrian of not feeling enough, but maybe the truth was simpler. He just didn't perform it. He didn't need applause to be real. I didn't knock. I couldn't. I just sat in the car until the lights went out, then drove home. When I got back, another envelope was waiting on the doorstep. I thought it was another bill, but inside was a single note in Adrian's handwriting. "Please use the mediation center for any communication. Do not contact me directly. I wish you peace." That was all. I laughed at the irony. Peace was what I'd demanded all along, and now it was the only thing he would give me. That night, I poured wine into a glass and sat by the window. The city outside was quiet, the same kind of quiet that used to comfort me. Now it felt like a verdict. I opened my phone and scrolled through old messages, the ones I'd sent Adrian months ago, the ones he'd never answered. "You're overreacting. You're cold. You'll come back." Each one sounded smaller than the last, like echoes from someone who'd mistaken noise for power. A notification popped up from social media. Someone had tagged me in a comment under an article titled, "When Humiliation Ends a Marriage." I didn't click it. I didn't have to. I already knew how people told the story. The quiet husband, the arrogant wife, the dinner, the applause. And somewhere between those details, they'd turned me into a lesson. It should have made me furious. Instead, I just felt hollow. Because they weren't wrong. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of what used to be Liam's room. The walls were bare now, the posters gone. The small indent in the carpet where his bed had been was still visible, like a ghost of his weight. I sat on the floor and whispered, "He'll come back." But I knew he wouldn't, not until he was old enough to decide for himself what kind of person his mother really was. Downstairs, the clock ticked past midnight. The house didn't creak anymore. Even it seemed done with me. I gathered the court papers, folded them neatly, and placed them in a drawer beside the wine glass. For a long moment, I thought about writing Adrian a letter. Something raw, something that would make him remember the version of me he once loved. But then I remembered the look on his face that night at the restaurant. Calm, finished, untouchable. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. So I didn't write. I didn't speak. I just sat there in the silence I had created and realized it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to him. And that was how it ended. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with quiet so complete that even my thoughts started to whisper. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.